Welcome to the University of Southampton's English Department podcast for A-level students. My name is Will May. I'm Head of English here, and I'll be talking in this podcast with a current English undergraduate student about reading an unseen piece of prose. And I'm lucky to be joined here by Ulfat.
So, hello everyone, my name is Ulfat Islam and I am currently in my second year at the University of Southampton reading English. So a little bit about me. I am originally from Southampton anyway. I'm Southampton born and bred, and I attended Bitton Park Secondary School. And the exam board that I was on for English literature was AQA, English Literature A.
So the section we're going to be looking at today is studying an unseen piece of prose. Now, this is quite a different kind of challenge and opportunity from your other aspects of the A-level, and it can seem quite daunting. You walk into exam, you've never seen something before, and you have to respond to it and use all those tricks of analysis and techniques you've been learning across your 2 years in A-level. So, Ulfat, what was your experience of doing that? Did you find it kind of daunting or different? How did you prepare?
So the first time that I encountered the unseen passage was in my AS level, so my first year of A-levels, and that was in the form of one unseen prose extract, which upon looking at first time round, I was absolutely sort of thrown back, I guess, and it was quite daunting. But sort of upon rereading it once more, I realised that this was something that I was, I guess, familiar with in some way, because it was from a time period that I had looked into and researched quite well. And so that's quite key, making sure that you look at the context of this piece and sort of jot down as many connotations of that time period and the authorship as you can. The second time and the most recent time that I encountered an unseen passage was in my second year of A-level, and that was in the form of 2 unseen poems and 1 unseen piece of prose. I remember particularly well my comparative essay on 2 pieces of unseen poems, and one was a 17th century piece and one a 20th century piece. My main aims sort of for constructing a response to the question on a comparison was to forge both similarities and differences between them. Again, I stressed the fact that I had to look at the dates and sort of look at any connotations that come up in my mind related to them, looking at context, so looking at the social, literary, historical and political context of each respective text. And then I soon eventually realised that actually there are some tropes and themes here that I actually know already, so I guess I should have told myself not to stress out so much, because even though the actual text itself is quite alien, its background is rather well known.
Fantastic, thanks very much. And that's really key as well, is that all the reading and thinking you're doing for your other texts is going to help you. So this is something where each novel you read, every piece of prose you read, as you're sharpening and honing your skills and analysis, that's going to help with this. So rather than seeing it as something completely different because it's unseen, think about the fact that everything you have seen before is going to be helpful, and the more you read.
Absolutely, yeah. Your sort of reading beyond your set A-level text is going to really inform your responses to the unseen passage.
And it can also be a really nice moment to think about how much you learned during your A-levels. So you might find that this is a task which at the beginning of A-level seems quite terrifying, and actually the more you read and the more you're making connections between texts, the more it's something you're comfortable with and can really enjoy doing as well. It's also a great opportunity to think about university study as well, in that when you get to study university level English, you'll be looking at all kinds of texts from week to week, so it's really extraordinarily helpful to have this practice of reading a kind of diverse range of texts.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm going to take us on to the text itself. So this comes from the opening of a 19th century novel, and the novel is Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, who's an author which you might have studied before at GCSE or A-level, although it's a book which doesn't often come up on the syllabus. It's one of his later novels, his last in fact. It's called Jude the Obscure. It was published in 1895. One of the reasons it might be interesting for us to think about as well is it describes somebody who's thinking about going to university. So I thought it might be a particularly nice one for us to look at. So I'll just read the passage through once, and you can find it too at the end of the bibliography, and then we'll have a conversation about some interesting features in this opening passage of the novel. The schoolmaster was leaving the village, and everybody seemed sorry. The miller at Crescombe lent him the small, white, tilted cart and horse to carry his goods to the city of his destination, about 20 miles off, such a vehicle proving of quite sufficient size for the departing teacher's effects. For the schoolhouse had been partly furnished by the managers, and the only cumbersome article possessed by the master, in addition to the packing case of books, was a cottage piano that he had bought at an auction during the year in which he thought of learning instrumental music. But the enthusiasm having waned, he had never acquired any skill in playing, and the purchased article had been perpetual trouble to him ever since in moving house. The rector had gone away for the day, being a man who disliked the sight of changes. He did not mean to return till the evening, when the new school teacher would have arrived and settled in, and everything would be smooth again. The blacksmith, the farm bailiff, and the schoolmaster himself were standing in perplexed attitudes in the parlour before the instrument. The master had remarked that even if he got it into the cart, he should not know what to do with it on his arrival at Christminster, the city he was bound for, since he was only going into temporary lodgings just at first. A little boy of 11, who had been thoughtfully assisting in the packing, joined the group of men, and as they rubbed their chins, he spoke up, blushing at the sound of his own voice. "Aunt have got a great fuel house, and it could be put there, perhaps, till you found a place to settle in, sir." "A proper good notion," said the blacksmith. It was decided that a deputation should wait on the boy's aunt, an old maiden resident, and ask her if she would house the piano till Mr. Phillotson should send for it. The smith and the bailiff started to see about the practicability of the suggested shelter, and the boy and the schoolmaster were left standing alone. "Sorry I'm going, Jude?" asked the latter, kindly. Tears rose into the boy's eyes, for he was not among the regular day scholars who came unromantically close to the schoolmaster's life, but one who had attended the night school only during a present teacher's term of office. The regular scholars, if the truth must be told, stood at the present moment afar off, like certain historic disciples, indisposed to any enthusiastic volunteering of aid. The boy awkwardly opened the book he held in his hand, which Mr. Phillotson had bestowed on him as a parting gift, and admitted that he was sorry. "So am I," said Mr. Phillotson. "Why do you go, sir?" asked the boy. "Ah, that would be a long story. You wouldn't understand my reasons, Jude. You will, perhaps, when you are older." "I think I should now, sir." "Well, don't speak of this anywhere. You know what a university is, and a university degree? It is the necessary hallmark of a man who wants to do anything in teaching. My scheme, or dream, is to be a university graduate and then to be ordained. By going to live at Christminster, or near it, I shall be at headquarters, so to speak, and if my scheme is practicable at all, I consider that being on the spot will afford me a better chance of carrying it out than I should have elsewhere. Okay, so that's the end of the passage, and perhaps unusually for the opening of a novel, there's quite a lot of dialogue.
Yeah, there really is. There's a lot of, I guess, a bit of action going on as well.
Yeah, and what kinds of things do you notice just on that first reading of the passage, or what kind of things strike you as unusual or interesting?
So, the first thing that I noticed was, as you just said, Will, the fact that there was quite a bit of action going on, and you could actually hear the characters themselves. There's not a lot of narration going on, which is rather unusual. But I guess the first I started noticing the themes arising upon sort of second and third reading. So themes such as education, desire, isolation becoming quite apparent. And also looking at the date, so 1895, something quite fin de siècle. So with that, I guess, there are connotations of a declining mood, but also looking forward to something new, which if you relate it back to Phillotson going off to university to get a degree, that's also something quite exciting. So, yeah. What about you? What did you think upon first reading?
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, actually. I've you've picked up on the date there as well, and thought about the idea of, something ending, but
Yes.
also the idea of dramatic change, which is also where we are in this first scene. It's interesting as well. I was kind of struck by the way people move and appear in this first passage as well. So although you've got that sort of vivid dialogue, haven't you? But the sense that other people are sort of in the background, almost like outline figures. We don't know much about them. They seem sort of somewhat distant as well.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. We might think the idea of going somewhere new, trying something new, would be quite exciting. But there's oddly a sense, isn't there, that no one quite knows what to say.
No, everyone seems sort of lost for words, and as you said, there are some people on the periphery just sort of looking as this figure is sort of leaving, and there is this sense of sorrow, even though there is excitement in the actual person that's actually leaving. Others are sort of looking on with sorrow and sadness, which is strange, I think.
Yeah, so it kind of a slightly mixed mood, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I suppose one of the things that's really important with an unseen piece of prose or poetry is to give yourself time to read and reread and rethink. And with any of these things, a lot more is going to come out on a second reading or a third reading than the first. So although, in an exam you're really anxious to get your thoughts on the page, you really want to give yourself a chance to think about things.
Yeah.
So also, if we were just thinking about sort of, I suppose, guidelines for walking into a room looking at an unseen passage of prose, you've picked out some great things already in that first reading. So what kinds of questions are you asking yourself when you're faced with unseen prose? What kind of things might you pick out or look for?
So I think, given, I guess, the context of this passage, I would look at the narrative voice. So who's narrating? Are they also speaking? In this instance, no, they're not. So I would look at the narrative voice, the characters as well, and sort of who's talking. And in this particular passage, there's quite a bit going on in terms of characters and who's talking and saying what. So those are two things that I'd start with. But also looking at mood and atmosphere that's being created. So as we just picked up just then earlier, there is sort of quite a solemn mood, but also the sense of excitement. So I look at mood as well and atmosphere, which I guess links quite nicely to tone. So what is the tone of this passage? Not only of the individual sort of quotes from the characters, but also the passage itself. Is there a shift in tone? And why or why not? In this instance, I guess there is a bit of a shift towards the very end of sort of new hope. And of course, I'd refer back to my assessment objectives. So am I picking up on all of those? And am I sort of making relevant links across between the text itself and the AOs, which is obviously very, very important. But then also not sort of straitjacketing my response, I guess, and just sort of only sticking with those and I guess forcing them into the passage when there really isn't anything there that's relevant, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's a really helpful way to think about them, because I know particularly when looking at the unseen prose or poetry, you haven't sort of thought, this is how I hit this area 1 or area 2, but it's striking as well how many of them are really about connections. So exploring connections across literary texts, exploring literary texts informed by different interpretations, and shifting between personal, creative and informed responses.
Yeah.
So they're kind of specific objectives, but they're also ones which are encouraging you to make connections. So again, the more you can connect it with other texts you've read,
Yes, exactly.
the more helpful that might be.
I think one other thing that I'd like to add actually is to highlight or annotate what seems familiar but also what doesn't seem so familiar. So the things that sort of catch you out, that seem quite surprising or even out of place really, because I've realised since starting my undergraduate course that actually the stuff that doesn't seem like or that's sort of out of your comfort zone or out of your own knowledge is the stuff that really provides the most fruitful readings. So really sort of pick out the stuff that you're not so comfortable with and use that as a springboard instead of something that you should just sort of shy away from.
That's really interesting, because I suppose there is that moment of, you might go through and underline the words you don't know, and you might think,
for the safe option.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the thing I don't want to write about. But yeah, if you find something which is curious or unexpected, you think, I'm not quite sure what's going on there, that you're saying actually that's perhaps the sentence or the paragraph to focus on, rather than thinking, right, okay, well, I know what's happening in this paragraph, so I'll stick to that one. And just thinking about the passage we've read, are there particular sort of words we might want to underline, or things that seem unusual or unexpected, or I suppose things we might find kind of particularly difficult about the passage?
I think towards the very beginning, when the object of the specific object of the piano is, it's quite central towards the beginning. So I guess picking up on those sort of things, because every single author does write everything with a particular intention in mind. So perhaps sort of scan that and have a look at the significance of that in this passage, and why perhaps towards the end it's not there anymore, and why there is this, for example, the shift in tone, which is what I asked myself upon first reading. So why does the mood change, for example? What is the purpose of that, and what can that tell us about, I guess, a time period in general?
Yeah, that's interesting. So we almost start with the effect, so the effects we
Yes.
notice on the first reading, and then think, okay, why have we got an impression of that mood? What is it particularly that makes us think that? What word choices, and how does it shift? So maybe we just hone in a bit on that first paragraph, say. Was there any particular phrases or images where you thought, well, that creates a particular mood or a particular context? Or
I think the very first line was, the schoolmaster was leaving the village. That instantly just sort of, I guess, foreshadowed what was going to come later on in the passage. But it also instantly created that mood of someone is leaving, there's departure happening, so there's going to be some sort of sorrow associated with that.
Although it's interesting that it's everybody seems sorry.
Yes.
So if the first emotion you see in a novel is one which is kind of feigned and public, you kind of think, well, actually, are they really sorry? Are they more indifferent than that? Or it kind of creates that kind of solemnness or that detachment you've mentioned, you've talked about. And so there's lots of kind of practical discussion of the piano, how it might get there, and there's a sense in which people are thinking about practicalities because they don't want to think about wider things that might be happening or the threat of somebody leaving. What do you think the significance is then of the piano, which has sort of come back a little bit, the cottage piano that was bought in an auction? Why do you think we learn so much about how he got it, where it is, where it'll go to next? Why do you think the focus on the piano? That's quite unusual, isn't it?
It might, I guess, just be metaphorical in a sense. I guess in terms of its relationship with the schoolmaster, sort of trying to preserve memory, I guess, in a sense. And this idea of maybe not wanting to let go, or reluctance to letting go, which I'm sort of going on about the time period again and again, but the sort of idea of maybe not trying to sort of stick onto ideals that seem quite safe, and, not wanting to go into the new and progress.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it, that in the next paragraph, the rector had gone away for the day, being a man who disliked the sight of changes. And it does seem in this almost quite symbolic landscape that the rector or religion just seems to have vanished, or is kind of worried about change. And that's a kind of really interesting moment if you're thinking about the Victorian period. There are all these religious changes, all these societal changes, and how will the institutions respond?
And Jude himself is so curious. By the end, he wants to know, despite being in a position where no one really wants him to have a lot of knowledge about what's going on. He still is hungry for knowledge. And so this idea that, these people were curious about change and were quite excited by it, but at the same time they found it quite daunting, which I guess is how we all feel about an unseen passage really as well. We find it quite exciting and quite enthralling, but we also find it really daunting at the same time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. So it kind of describes the process for us too.
Yes.
Just coming back to that piano as well, I was sort of struck by ways in which at the beginning of a novel, if we're told that it's the opening of a novel, we might be looking for clues about what's going to happen or how things are going to pan out. So it's quite striking, isn't it, that actually he's, the piano is his one important object he's managed to retain, and he doesn't make lots of money, and the furnishings don't belong to him, so he has a real plan to learn. But what's happened? Can he play the piano? Do we think? It's interesting.
There's nothing really said on whether or not he can actually skillfully play it. It's more that he wants to sort of hold on to it and really sort of treasure it, and we're not sort of told whether or not this person can actually successfully play the piano. We just sort of know that this is a prized possession that he really doesn't want to let go of.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that we hear about his excitement about the piano, and then his enthusiasm wanes, and actually now it's a trouble to him.
Yeah.
And that's quite interesting, isn't it, that someone has an aspiration to learn something. They have a quest, they make immense personal sacrifice in order to get towards the object of learning, but actually he doesn't really seem to have learned the piano, and actually it's an encumbrance, which is quite quite an interesting idea, isn't it? Because if we think about the fact that he's apparently going to go to university to learn, it's interesting that so far his desire to bet himself or to make more room in his life,
superficial,
well, also not just superficial, but almost having a negative impact, like a chain around him as well, which is kind of quite interesting. It's perpetual trouble to him, which makes it sound almost like it's a kind of cough or a cold.
Yeah, and I mean he's sort of passing it down, I guess, to to someone who's I guess socially or socioeconomically lower to him.
Yes,
which is interesting.
Yeah.
So this sort of idea that now you can have this burden, which it now is, but it was once so sort of enthralling for me. So now it's your turn to sort of take that and lower down the food chain, I guess, which is interesting because once something so prized has now become, as you say, burdensome. Yeah,
and it's interesting as well because I mean that might make us think that what we're getting here is some foreshadowing. So we have a character called Jude, which we assume from the title is going to be the protagonist. Yes. We're meeting him as a young boy, and he seems very kind of attached to the schoolmaster all the way through. Is there anything particular that gives us that sense that he's attached, or that he has, in a kind of solemn mood, that his emotions are kind of to the fore?
I mean, I guess his emotional attachment. I mean, he's brought to tears by the idea of Phillotson moving away, and he's also comfortable enough to repeatedly ask him, tell me why, and why do you have to go, or why now? And that sort of ability for him to do that, I think, suggests that he's very comfortable within proximity of this individual. So I think this early on in the novel, the bond just sort of foreshadows the fact that this individual, Phillotson, is going to be of quite great importance and, I guess, inspiration to Jude.
It's interesting, and I suppose as well the kind of distance that we talked about, that we saw in the passage. I think Hardy goes out of his way to make other characters seem like they're only in outline. So we have that really wonderful phrase of the other scholars being like certain historic disciples. So coming back to that earlier rector moment, there's a kind of another kind of sense of religious vocabulary. But again, the sense they're sort of symbolic, they're quite inert, they're not really helping.
Interesting.
Which is quite kind of interesting. Thinking about, I suppose you as a reader now, and maybe thinking about some of the work you might have done in first year, do you think there are kind of ways of approaching this passage as a reader now that you're an undergraduate, which might have helped you at A-level, or kind of words you might pick out, or terms, or anything like this in particular?
I think sort of one thing that I've now learnt to do more, and sort of trying to master as I move through my course, is what I mentioned earlier, actually. So looking at the things that sort of catch me by surprise or seem quite unexpected. So that sort of recurring symbol or motif, I guess, of that piano in that particular passage is something that I came back to again and again upon rereading the extract. So now I've sort of learned to pick up on stuff that is quite surprising or atypical, but also looking at things that are quite implicit. So stuff that, unlike the piano motif, which is quite explicit, things that are sort of more, I guess, implicit, and stuff that's quite sort of coded and needs decoding. Which I guess is, upon first reading you won't catch it out, but upon second and third reading and fourth reading you very well might do. So now I actually actively look out for things that seem quite strange or weird or atypical, and I try to interrogate them by, I guess, relating them to texts that I've studied around that same sort of time period, to see if actually is this text as a whole quite typical, or is it atypical, and why or why not. And that almost always leads to really quite rich readings. I studied the novel in my first year, the module called the novel, and from that module I actually learnt terms like indirect discourse, which I sort of heard in fleeting capacities at A-level, but I sort of learned to really kind of solidify in undergraduate level. So applying those sort of terms and looking sort of beyond just content but also form as well, just looking at both of those in equal capacities really helped in terms of sort of getting richer readings from something like an unseen passage. And at first it might seem really quite tempting to just look at alliteration and sort of all of those sort of bog standard content analysis tools, but sort of looking at the form itself, so the genre, what style is it, what kind of narrative voice does it have, that sort of thing really helps also.
Yeah, fantastic. So thinking about those kind of first, second and third readings you've talked about, I wonder if it might have been an interesting moment for us to go through the passage almost paragraph by paragraph and just think about the things that for us are quite interesting and we might want to pick up, and then we could go on to think about how we might put it together in a response. So if we just start with that first paragraph, the schoolmaster was leaving the village and everybody seemed sorry. The miller at Crescombe lent him the small white tilted cart and horse to carry his goods to the city of his destination, about 20 miles off, such a vehicle proving of quite sufficient size for the departing teacher's effects. For the schoolhouse had been partly furnished by the managers, and the only cumbersome article possessed by the master, in addition to the packing case of books, was a cottage piano that had bought at an auction during the year in which he thought of learning instrumental music. But the enthusiasm having waned, he had never acquired any skill in playing, and the purchased article had been a perpetual trouble to him ever since in moving house. So we've already had a kind of conversation about some of those aspects. So just thinking about that first paragraph then and the mood that we've both picked up on, are there particular sort of things you'd underline from that passage? Or?
I think overall, sort of zooming out a bit on that paragraph, it's interesting that it sets the scene. It's sort of telling us, in sort of the form of an abstract of a journal article, it's telling us sort of what's going to happen, who's going to be involved in this scene, and also what's happening by the end. So the fact that this piano, in that one sort of first paragraph, shifts from being of quite sort of grave importance to one that's eventually going to turn out to be quite a burden, I think is quite metaphorical for everything else that's going to happen in the extract. So, this idea that, so the piano sort of shifts in itself, and I guess that's metaphorical for the mood that we're going to see shifting. So, and I guess of Phillotson himself, I guess this piano stands for him, in terms of him sort of holding certain ideals at one point in his life and now sort of abandoning them and moving on. Yeah,
and it's interesting, you sort of called him Phillotson, so we're looking ahead here, and I was kind of struck by actually, as we come back to the second reading, how much that the passage creates a sense of distance and impersonality by actually naming people just in terms of their job. So we have the schoolmaster, we have the miller, we have the managers, and so despite having this apparently emotional departure scene, actually Hardy works against that, doesn't he? By just giving a sense that everyone has a job and a role, and that's who they are, that's their identity.
And that's, I guess, their overriding identity.
Yeah,
I guess.
Absolutely. And outside of that, who knows who they are? We don't learn names till a bit later. And then the next paragraph, as we discussed, we have the rector, the man who dislikes the sight of change, having gone away and wants everything to be smooth again. So that's interesting. So that's kind of first sense that we begin to get of someone's particular personality. We may never meet the rector again, but what kind of thinking ahead again, what might that make us think that somebody leaves, they turn away because they actually don't want to have this goodbye, and they'd rather everything was just smooth and settled and they just come back?
It just, I guess, on a more broader level, just demonstrates the conflict between change and progress. I guess change and continuity. Sort of backward ideals versus social progress, which I think the rector himself embodies quite well. And I think between that first and second paragraph, we've had a very sort of seamless transition. The first paragraph just sort of tells us that actually this piano, as a motif, is an embodiment of this conflict between continuity and progress, which the rector then nicely, he sort of takes on that metaphorical role from the piano. Yeah,
that's a really interesting way of putting it. And then we have that sort of dialogue which comes in the middle of the passage, and again it's interesting that Jude, who's the central character, he's not introduced as Jude, he's a little boy of 11 who'd been thoughtfully assisting in the packing. So
isn't it interesting that the protagonist is reduced to someone who's quite peripheral in a sense?
Yeah, very strange that he's at the centre of this story, but he's peripheral. he's helping somebody else, doing something that might make him quite sad as well. And his first words are interesting, aren't they? We have lots of dialogue, but think about how that dialogue is introduced. Yeah. He spoke up blushing at the sound of his own voice.
Yeah, I mean, again, being a protagonist, he doesn't seem like he's mastered the central space. He's blushing, he's shy.
Yeah.
And yes, I don't think he has a lot of agency in this part of the novel, in this passage.
Yeah, it's interesting, and the sense in which the schoolmaster, sorry I'm going, Jude, is almost trying to sort of puncture him, get that sort of emotional response. So I think for both of them it seems like a departure which they know is freighted with quite a lot of meaning, I think. Then we have that impression then of that kind of embarrassment. Later we have that adverb awkwardly. The boy awkwardly opened the book he held in his hand and admitted he was sorry. So again,
it's almost like there's this sort of inability or reluctance towards being emotionally open.
Yes.
And sort of being able to express this sorrow, which is an absolutely okay way to feel, but clearly for Jude it needs quite a bit of sort of probing and opening up for him to sort of purge his emotions. And by the very end of the passage, I guess that's sort of happening a bit more. But he needs that sort of immediate provocation from the schoolmaster to then sort of open up, which is interesting. He seems so full of emotion, and yet he is so reluctant to open up.
Yes, and then the sort of the fullest explanation we get of what's happening, of course, comes in the final paragraph. You know what a university is, a university degree, the necessary hallmark of a man who wants to do anything in teaching. My scheme or dream is to be a university graduate, then to be ordained. By going to live at Christminster or near it, I shall be at headquarters, so to speak, and if my scheme is practicable at all, I consider that being on the spot will afford me a better chance of carrying it out than I should have elsewhere. So, again, without thinking about the rest of the novel, how confident are we that this is going to work out for him, do we think?
I mean, he just seems so intent that it is going to work out. And his Philipson's ambitions are quite clearly high. And the things that he says, first of all, just, the university degree being this kind of this key to so many doors, and it's almost the answer. And he seems so intent upon obtaining it, and he knows, I think, or he thinks he knows that he's going to be successful. You
say thinks he knows, so I see already qualifying, which is quite interesting, because the passage itself has quite a lot of equivocations, quite a lot of qualifiers, doesn't it? So actually, it's not as if he knows he'll be able to.
No, and I think following on from what you've just said there, his, the amount of room or space that he has in this passage at the very end, or the length of, I guess, his quotation is quite, it's quite long. So it's almost as if he needs to reassure himself that this is going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, we don't know if it's going to be okay because we're cut off at that point. But we're sort of left with this idea that, are you really sure that you're going to be able to succeed in this venture? Because you have an awful lot of reassurance going on here.
Yeah.
So why do you need that reassurance?
Yeah, absolutely. So psychologically, we kind of think, well, actually, is this going to be happening? Yeah. He says, is it practicable at all? Maybe it's not, so to speak, or near it. Suddenly, actually, it's not that he's suddenly going to a university to begin study. It's more that he thinks by getting himself closer to the place where he hopes it might be possible to do it, it might become nearer to him. But we've already heard from that piano that he might have an aspiration to do something, but it might not.
And he might move on from that.
Absolutely,
or
might come to pass.
Ideal,
and it might be a kind of trouble or a burden to him as well. So that kind of introduces a really big theme, perhaps, in the novel. So having done that kind of close, detailed, careful work, what might we do in terms of structuring that as a response? Because you've picked out so many different things you might want to do there. Would you think about going schematically through the whole passage, or would you organise it by theme? What are some different things you might have tried when doing unseen prose?
During my A-levels, I went very much sort of thematically, so organising my response to the passage by theme, which I think I retained that even at undergraduate level, but I try to pick up nuances now, more so than I did at A-level. So I think the way that I go about structuring this essay in the first instance is gathering up those themes, so from, I guess, the most predominant ones to the less predominant ones. So we've talked a lot about the theme of kind of desire and new and exciting things coming about, and then also letting go, and isolation as well. So I start off by, I guess, putting those themes up on the top of my page, and then extracting key quotes that reflect those themes. That would be sort of my first port of call. And then trying to find nuances between my readings. So we've looked at the piano as a symbol of continuity versus social progress, and we've also said the same for the rector. But maybe sort of also look at what else these motifs or these characters could embody, which I think would enable a more richer reading and a more sort of subtle reading as well, something not so black and white, which also invites the reader, I guess, to look at certain things in different ways. Yeah,
great. So that work you were doing to kind of highlight the mood you might get in the first reading, in the second reading, thinking about the particular literary techniques or words or phrases that give that mood, and then sort of, I suppose, the third layer is thinking about the wider context. It is a fin de siècle novel, as something which is at a time of great social and religious change, and seeing how uneasy that change makes everybody, which we can see on this kind of wonderfully local moment of someone leaving a community, which is clearly a traditional community where everyone's defined by their role. They are their role in the village. And if you go outside, who knows what your role might be, who knows what might happen, and who knows what it might be to live outside those identities. So it does kind of raise all those questions as well. I was thinking as well, obviously we've talked for kind of 20, 30 minutes or so, and it's been a really rich conversation, and hopefully it's also given you a sense that when you're doing an unseen passage, it's worth taking time to think through things, because I think our first reading, when we were looking at effects, and then how it expanded when we looked at the real detail of the language, did change things a little bit and create a bit more nuance. And thinking back to that moment of doing the unseen passage, is there a particular piece of advice you would give yourself in terms of thinking, gosh, if I did it again now, I'm sure you might want to, you might not want to, you'd do this?
Yeah, I think my main piece of advice would be, don't be intimidated by what you don't know, or what comes up as surprising in the passage. You know, the piano, oh gosh, that was sort of quite striking for me at first, because I made sense of the characters and the scene in general quite well and quite quickly actually, but then that piano it really stuck with me, and I really wanted to know exactly what its significance was, because it was just so unfamiliar to me in that context. So I'd say just don't be intimidated by what you don't know, but instead use it as a springboard to really come up with some really cool and original ideas that you might not have anticipated yourself.
Fantastic, excellent. Thank you, Ulfa. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
To help people out. I think as well, I'd say again, it's definitely a part of the exam, part of the A-level, which really benefits further reading and wider reading. And also take the opportunity to look at sort of unseen explications wherever you go. So it might be looking at the kind of the poem of the week in The Guardian, which shows you how to explicate a poem, or maybe just try for yourself, picking up the first page of a novel and seeing what you pick out and why.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a chance to show off everything that you've read outside of your syllabus as well. So really make the most of it, and good luck.
Great. Thanks very much, Ulfa, and we hope you've enjoyed this podcast and found it helpful.
Thank you very much.